There's nothing quite as painful as being invisible in your own hometown, surrounded by people who refuse to see your worth. For 23-year-old Miriam Sinclair, every day in Cedar Hollow meant enduring the cruel stares and whispered comments about the deaf girl who lived alone on the edge of town. The year was 1,887 inches Colorado territory, and folks didn't much understand what they feared. Miriam had a gift for healing with herbs that grew wild in the mountains, but the townspeople saw only her silence. They mocked her gentle ways and dismissed her knowledge as worthless superstition. Then one cold morning, a stranger rode into town. Josiah Brennan was a mountain man with desperate eyes and a dying brother. He needed help that no doctor could provide. Would this rugged outsider become the first person to truly see Miriam for who she was? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The frost clung to the window panes of Miriam Sinclair's small cabin like delicate lacework, each crystal catching the pale morning light that filtered through the pine trees. She moved through her familiar routine with practiced grace, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors that had known her step for 23 years. The worn leather herb pouch hung from her waist, its contents rustling softly as she gathered dried chamomile and willow bark from the shelves that lined her kitchen walls. Cedar Hollow had never been kind to those who were different, and Miriam had learned early that her deafness marked her as an outsider in the small mountain settlement. The townspeople saw her condition not as a simple difference, but as something to be pitied at best, feared at worst. They whispered that her silence was unnatural, that perhaps the Lord had struck her mute for some hidden sin. What they failed to understand was that Miriam's world was far from silent. She felt the vibrations of footsteps on wooden boardwalks, saw the movement of lips and the expressions that revealed more than words ever could, and understood the language of growing things in ways that escaped those who relied solely on their ears. Her Aunt Constance stirred in the bedroom, the floorboards creaking under her frail weight. At 78, Constance Sinclair was the only family Miriam had left, and the only person in Cedar Hollow who had ever shown her genuine kindness. The old woman had taken Miriam in after the fever claimed both her parents when she was 12, and had spent years teaching her to read lips and communicate through gestures that only the two of them fully understood. Miriam prepared a cup of pine needle tea for her aunt, adding a touch of honey from the hives she kept behind the cabin. The morning ritual brought comfort to both women. Constance with her arthritis and failing eyesight, Miriam with her need to care for someone who had never seen her as broken. 20 miles northeast, in a cabin perched precariously on the edge of a granite cliff, Josiah Brennan knelt beside his brother's sickbed with hands that shook despite their size and strength. Nathan's breathing came in shallow gasps, his once robust frame now gaunt and pale beneath threadbare blankets. The fever had been burning through him for 6 days, and the medicine Josiah had managed to obtain from the last settlement was proving useless against whatever was consuming his younger brother from within. Josiah pulled the silver compass from his vest pocket, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. Their father had carried it through the war, and it had guided them through countless journeys across the untamed territories. Now it seemed to mock him with its steady needle, pointing always towards certainty, while his own direction had never felt more uncertain. "I'm going down to Cedar Hollow," he whispered to Nathan, though he wasn't sure his brother could hear him anymore. "Doc said there's someone there who might know about mountain remedies. Someone who understands plants better than most." Nathan's eyelids fluttered, and for a moment Josiah thought he might respond. But his brother's breathing only grew more labored. Time was running out, and Josiah knew that this trip to Cedar Hollow might be Nathan's last hope. The ride down the mountain took 3 hours, his horse picking its way carefully along the narrow trail that switchbacked through stands of aspen and pine. Josiah had heard stories about Cedar Hollow, a settlement that had grown up around a small silver mine and stubbornly clung to existence even after the easy ore played out. It was the kind of place where strangers were viewed with suspicion, and outsiders were tolerated only as long as they didn't upset the delicate balance of small-town life. As he crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley, Josiah could see the settlement spread out below him like a child's toy village. Smoke rose from perhaps 30 chimneys, and the main street was little more than a dirt track lined with weathered buildings that had seen better days. The church steeple rose above the other structures, its white paint peeling but still reaching toward the mountain sky with determined faith. Josiah guided his horse down the main street, acutely aware of the curious stares that followed his progress. He was a large man, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders broadened by years of hard labor and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. His clothes marked him as a mountain dweller, sturdy wool and leather that could withstand harsh weather but would never be mistaken for fashionable. The holstered pistol at his hip was functional rather than ornamental, and his eyes held the wariness of a man who had learned that civilization could be more dangerous than wilderness. The doctor's office occupied a narrow building squeezed between the general store and a boarding house. Dr. Pemberton was a thin, nervous man in his 50s who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by the medical needs of the settlement. When Josiah described Nathan's symptoms, the doctor shook his head with the resigned air of a man who had reached the limits of his knowledge. "I've seen this before, Doctor," Pemberton admitted, removing his spectacles to clean them with shaking hands. "Mountain fever, some call it. Comes on sudden and burns through a man fast. I've got laudanum for the pain, but nothing that'll break the fever or clear the lungs." "Someone mentioned there might be folks here who know about plant medicine," Josiah said, his voice carefully controlled despite the desperation clawing at his chest. Dr. Pemberton glanced toward the window, then lowered his voice. "There's the Sinclair woman, lives on the east edge of town, with her aunt. She knows plants, I'll give her that, but she's—" He paused, clearly uncomfortable. "She's deaf, you understand. Simple-minded, most folks think, don't know how much real help she'd be." Josiah felt his jaw tighten. "Where might I find her?" "Follow the main road east until it forks, then take the left path. Little cabin set back in the trees. But I'm telling you, she's not right in the head. The deafness, you know it affects their thinking." Josiah left the doctor's office with directions, but also with a growing anger at the casual dismissal he'd heard in the man's voice. He'd known men who'd lost their hearing to cannon fire during the war, and they were some of the sharpest, most observant people he'd ever encountered. The idea that someone's worth could be judged by whether they could hear seemed both cruel and ignorant. The cabin was exactly where Dr. Pemberton had said it would be, set among tall pines that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns of gold and green. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Josiah could see a small garden plot where someone had been working recently. The whole place had an air of quiet order that spoke of careful tending and genuine love for the land. As he dismounted and tied his horse to a pine tree, Josiah noticed a young woman kneeling in what appeared to be an herb garden beside the cabin. She was small and delicate, with dark hair that caught copper highlights in the filtered sunlight, and she moved among the plants with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. Her hands worked quickly and surely, selecting specific leaves and stems that she placed in a wicker basket beside her. Miriam felt the vibration of approaching footsteps through the ground before she saw the shadow fall across her garden. She looked up to find a tall stranger standing at the edge of her herb patch, and his hat in his hands, and his face bearing an expression of careful respect that was so different from the usual looks she received in town that it momentarily took her breath away. The man was clearly a mountain dweller, with the weathered skin and alert eyes of someone who lived close to the wilderness. But there was something else in his expression, a desperate hope mixed with genuine uncertainty. He wasn't looking at her with pity or dismissal, but with the careful attention of someone who genuinely needed help and wasn't sure how to ask for it. Josiah found himself momentarily at a loss for words. The young woman who looked up at him from the herb garden was nothing like what Dr. Pemberton's dismissive description had led him to expect. Her eyes were intelligent and alert, and the way she moved among the plants spoke of extensive knowledge and careful observation. She was also beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or artifice. Hers was the natural beauty of someone who belonged to the mountain landscape, like the wildflowers that grew in the high meadows. "Miss Sinclair?" he asked, then felt foolish as he realized she probably couldn't hear him. Miriam read his lips easily and nodded, rising gracefully from her kneeling position in the garden. She dusted the soil from her hands and waited, her expression patient and questioning. Something about this stranger's manner told her that he had come seeking help rather than offering judgment, and that alone was enough to make her willing to listen to whatever he might need to communicate. Josiah struggled for a moment with how to explain his situation, then pointed to himself and said slowly, "Josiah Brennan, my brother is sick, very sick." He touched his chest and made a gesture that he hoped would convey breathing difficulties. Miriam watched his face carefully, reading the words from his lips and understanding the gestures he was making. When he finished, she nodded and gestured for him to wait. She disappeared into the cabin, returning a moment later with a small slate and piece of chalk. "What are his symptoms?" she wrote in clear, precise handwriting. Josiah felt a surge of relief. This was going to work. He described Nathan's fever, the difficulty breathing, the weakness that had come on so suddenly. Miriam listened, or rather, watched with complete attention, occasionally asking follow-up questions on her slate. When he finished, she wrote, "Mountain fever. I have seen this before. There are plants that can help, but they must be gathered from high places. Dangerous to collect alone. I'll go anywhere," Josiah wrote beneath her words. "Do anything. He's my only family." Miriam studied his face for a long moment, seeing the genuine desperation and love there. Then she nodded decisively and wrote, "Tomorrow at first light, bring warm clothes and strong rope. The plants we need grow on cliff faces." As Josiah prepared to leave, he felt the first stirring of hope he'd experienced since Nathan had fallen ill. This young woman clearly knew what she was talking about, and her willingness to help a complete stranger spoke to a generosity of spirit that he found both surprising and deeply moving. What he didn't realize, as he mounted his horse and began the ride back up the mountain, was that their brief encounter had been observed by several townspeople who had nothing better to do than speculate about the affairs of others. By the time the sun set over Cedar Hollow, word had spread that the deaf Sinclair girl had been seen talking to a dangerous-looking stranger, and the gossips were already sharpening their tongues for the feast of speculation to come. Dawn came softly to Cedar Hollow, painting the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold. Miriam had been awake for an hour, carefully packing her leather satchel with the tools she would need for the day's dangerous work. Her handwritten herb guide lay open on the kitchen table, its pages filled with detailed drawings and notes that represented years of careful observation and experimentation. Each plant was meticulously documented where it grew, when to harvest it, how to prepare it, and what ailments it could treat. The book itself was a testament to Miriam's intelligence and dedication, though she doubted anyone in Cedar Hollow had ever bothered to examine it closely enough to understand its value. The townspeople saw her careful notations as the scribblings of a simple mind, never recognizing the sophisticated understanding of botanical medicine that lay within those pages. Josiah arrived precisely at first light, leading a pack-horse behind his own mount. He had followed Miriam's advice about warm clothing and rope, and she could see that he had come prepared for serious mountain work. What surprised her was the expression of respectful attention on his face as he waited for her to finish her preparations. Most people grew impatient with the extra time it took to communicate with her, but this mountain man seemed content to wait and watch as she completed her methodical preparation. She emerged from the cabin carrying her herb guide and a collection of leather pouches, canvas bags, and small harvesting tools. Josiah dismounted and approached her, moving slowly so as not to startle her. When she held up the herb guide, opening it to a page that showed detailed drawings of the plants they would be seeking, his eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "You drew all of these?" he asked, forgetting for a moment that she couldn't hear him. Miriam read his lips and nodded, then flipped through several pages to show him the extent of her documentation. She had illustrated not just the plants themselves, but their root systems, their seasonal variations, and even the insects and animals that were often found near them. It was the work of someone with both artistic skill and scientific understanding. Josiah shook his head in amazement. Dr. Pemberton had been completely wrong about this young woman. The book in her hands represented a level of knowledge that would have impressed university-trained botanists. Yet she lived in isolation at the edge of a small mountain town where people dismissed her as simple-minded. They were so absorbed in examining the herb guide that neither of them noticed the small crowd that had gathered near the general store. Cedar Hollow was the kind of place where any unusual activity drew attention, and the sight of Miriam Sinclair preparing to leave town with a dangerous-looking stranger was more excitement than the settlement had seen in months. Martha Hendricks, the postmaster's wife, stood with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a disapproving line. "It's not natural," she declared to anyone within hearing distance. "That girl has no business going off into the mountains with a man like that." "What do you suppose he wants with her?" asked Prudence Wells, the banker's widow. "He doesn't look like the type to need help with herbs and such. Maybe he's heard about her condition," suggested Thomas Reed, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Some men prefer women who can't talk back." The cruel laughter that followed this comment would have wounded Miriam deeply if she had been able to hear it, but she remained focused on explaining to Josiah exactly where they needed to go and what they needed to find. Using a combination of gestures, sketches in the dirt, and carefully written notes, she conveyed that their destination was a series of cliff faces about 2 hours' ride up the mountain, where a particular variety of alpine herb grew in the crevices of the rock. As they mounted their horses and prepared to leave, Reverend Morrison approached from the direction of the church. He was a stern man in his 60s who had appointed himself the moral guardian of Cedar Hollow, and his expression suggested that he did not approve of what he was witnessing. "Miss Sinclair," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "A word, if you please." Miriam didn't hear him, but she saw Josiah's expression change and turned to follow his gaze. The Reverend was striding toward them with the purposeful step of a man who intended to interfere, and several townspeople had gathered behind him like a small mob of the righteously indignant. Josiah dismounted and positioned himself between Miriam and the approaching group. His hand didn't move toward his weapon, but something in his stance suggested that he was prepared for trouble. "Reverend," Josiah said politely but firmly, "is there a problem?" "I don't believe we've been introduced," Morrison replied, his eyes never leaving Miriam. "I'm Reverend Morrison, and I feel a responsibility for the welfare of my parishioners, particularly those who might be vulnerable to the attentions of strangers." The insult was delivered in the polite language of civilized discourse, but its meaning was clear enough. Josiah felt his temper begin to rise, but forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper would only make things worse for Miriam. "My name is Josiah Brennan," he said evenly. "Miss Sinclair has kindly agreed to help me gather some medicinal plants for my sick brother. We should be back before nightfall. I'm sure Miss Sinclair means well," the Reverend continued, "but she's not equipped to make decisions about certain matters. Perhaps it would be better if she remained in town where proper supervision can be provided." Miriam had been watching the exchange with growing anger. She could read enough from their expressions and body language to understand that she was being discussed as if she weren't present, treated like a child or an invalid who couldn't be trusted to make her own choices. It was a familiar humiliation, but somehow it stung more sharply with Josiah there to witness it. She dismounted and walked directly to Reverend Morrison, pulling her herb guide from her satchel. She opened it to a page that showed detailed anatomical drawings of medicinal plants and their therapeutic properties, then held it up for him to see. Her meaning was clear. She was not the simple-minded creature they all believed her to be. Morrison glanced at the book dismissively. "I'm sure it's very pretty, my dear, But Miriam's patience finally snapped. She snatched the book back and strode to the hitching post, where several horses were tied. Selecting a bay mare that belonged to the banker, she ran her hands along the animal's legs with professional confidence, then returned to Morrison with her slate. She wrote quickly, "This horse has early navicular disease. Left front hoof. Will go lame within 6 months without treatment. White willow bark tea, daily. Your own horse has worms. Pine needle decoction will clear them." She thrust the slate at Morrison, then walked to each horse in turn, writing rapid diagnoses and treatments for conditions that their owners had either not noticed or had been unable to identify. Her assessments were detailed, specific, and delivered with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. The crowd fell silent as they read her notations. Several of the horse owners looked uncomfortable, recognizing symptoms in their animals that they had indeed observed but hadn't known how to interpret. Josiah watched this display with growing admiration. In the space of a few minutes, Miriam had demonstrated more practical knowledge than most people acquired in a lifetime, and she had done it with a quiet dignity that made her detractors look foolish and small-minded. "Miss Sinclair knows what she's doing," he said quietly to the Reverend, "and she's old enough to make her own choices about how to spend her time." Morrison's face had reddened with embarrassment, but he wasn't ready to back down entirely. "Be that as it may, it's not proper for an unmarried woman to go off into the wilderness with a strange man. What will people think?" "I imagine they'll think whatever they've already decided to think," Josiah replied. "But my brother is dying, and Miss Sinclair might be able to save his life. That seems more important than gossip." He remounted his horse and waited while Miriam packed her herb guide and slate back into her satchel. As she swung up onto her own mount, she caught sight of the faces watching them from around the settlement. Some showed disapproval, others curiosity, but none showed the respect or understanding that she had seen in Josiah's eyes. For the first time in her adult life, Miriam found herself not caring what the people of Cedar Hollow thought about her choices. She had spent 23 years trying to earn their acceptance and understanding, and it had brought her nothing but loneliness and frustration. This mountain man had shown her more genuine respect in 2 brief meetings than she had received from her own community in years. As they rode out of town together, Miriam felt something shifting inside her, a recognition that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Behind them, the townspeople continued to watch and whisper, but for the first time, their opinions felt distant and unimportant. What mattered now was the man riding beside her, the sick brother who needed their help, and the dangerous journey that lay ahead of them in the high country where the healing plants grew. The mountain trail wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, the horses picking their way carefully over loose stones and fallen logs. Miriam rode with the easy grace of someone who had spent countless hours in the saddle, her eyes constantly scanning the forest around them for signs of the plants they sought. Josiah found himself watching her with growing fascination, noting how she seemed to read the landscape like a book written in a language only she understood. When they paused to rest the horses beside a small stream, Miriam dismounted and knelt by the water's edge, running her fingers through the sandy soil. She beckoned to Josiah, then pointed to a cluster of small white flowers growing among the rocks. Using gestures and quick sketches in the dirt, she explained that these were early spring beauties, valuable for treating stomach ailments, but not what they were looking for today. Josiah pulled a small notebook from his vest pocket and began attempting to copy her gestures, adding simple words beneath his rough drawings. When Miriam saw what he was doing, her face lit up with surprise and pleasure. Most people grew impatient with her need to communicate through signs and written words, but this mountain man was actually trying to learn her language. She took the notebook from him and added more detailed descriptions beneath his sketches, then showed him the proper hand signals for water, plant, and medicine. Josiah repeated the gestures carefully, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness as he tried to match her precise movements. Their communication was slow and sometimes frustrating, but there was something deeply satisfying about the effort they were both making to understand each other. Miriam had never experienced anything like it, someone taking the time to truly listen to what she was trying to say, someone who seemed to value her knowledge and respect her intelligence. As they continued up the mountain, Josiah found himself thinking about Nathan and the carved wooden cross that hung around his younger brother's neck. Their father had given it to Nathan on his 16th birthday, telling him that faith and family were the only things in life that truly mattered. Nathan had worn it ever since, through countless moves and hardships, never losing the optimistic spirit that had carried him through every difficulty. Now Nathan lay dying in their mountain cabin, the cross rising and falling with each labored breath, and Josiah felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical burden. He was the older brother, the protector, the one who was supposed to keep them both safe in a world that had shown them precious little kindness. If Nathan died, Josiah would have failed in the most fundamental way possible. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous as they climbed higher, but Miriam navigated it with confidence, born of long experience. When they came to a section where recent rockfall had blocked the main path, she led them around the obstacle by a route that Josiah would never have found on his own. Her knowledge of these mountains was comprehensive and practical, gained through years of patient exploration in search of medicinal plants. They were crossing a narrow ledge when Miriam suddenly held up her hand, bringing them to an immediate halt. She dismounted and moved forward on foot, her movements careful and deliberate. Josiah followed her gaze and felt his stomach clench as he realized what she had seen. The ledge ahead had been undermined by spring runoff, and what looked like solid ground was actually a thin crust of soil over empty air. Without Miriam's sharp eyes and intimate knowledge of the mountain's dangers, they would have ridden straight into a trap that could have killed them both. Josiah felt a surge of gratitude, mixed with new respect for this quiet young woman who had just saved their lives with her careful observation. They backtracked and found an alternative route, but the incident had driven home how much he had come to depend on Miriam's expertise. She wasn't just helping him find medicinal plants, she was keeping them both alive in terrain that could be deadly to the unwary. When they finally reached the cliff faces where the alpine herbs grew, Josiah understood why Miriam had insisted he bring rope. The plants they needed clung to narrow crevices in the rock wall, accessible only to someone willing to rappel down the sheer stone face while maintaining enough control to harvest delicate stems and leaves. Miriam secured the rope around a sturdy pine tree and tested the knots with practiced efficiency. When she began preparing to make the descent herself, Josiah caught her arm and shook his head firmly. He pointed to himself, then to the rope, making it clear that he intended to do the dangerous work. Miriam studied his face for a moment, seeing the determination there, then nodded reluctantly. She opened her herb guide to the relevant page and showed him exactly what to look for: the size and shape of the leaves, the small clusters of pale blue flowers, the distinctive way the stems emerged from cracks in the rock. Her drawings were so detailed that Josiah felt confident he could identify the right plants even without her guidance. The descent was harrowing, requiring him to control his weight with one hand while using the other to carefully harvest the precious herbs. More than once, loose rock crumbled under his boots, sending stones cascading down the cliff face with ominous clattering sounds. But Miriam's rope work was solid, and her hand signals from above helped guide him to the richest concentrations of the plants they needed. When he finally hauled himself back up to the top of the cliff, his hands full of carefully gathered herbs, Miriam's face showed relief mixed with admiration. She had watched him work with growing respect, noting how he followed her instructions precisely and took no unnecessary risks with the valuable plants. As they prepared the herbs for transport, wrapping them carefully in damp cloth to preserve their potency, Josiah found himself thinking about the morning's events. The townspeople of Cedar Hollow had treated Miriam like a burden or an object of pity, but the truth was exactly the opposite. She was the most competent and knowledgeable person he had encountered in years of mountain living, and her quiet strength was something he found both impressive and deeply attractive. The ride back down the mountain was easier, but they both remained alert for potential dangers. Miriam continued to point out plants and natural landmarks, and Josiah continued to practice the hand signals she had taught him. By the time they reached the lower elevations, he could manage simple conversations about their immediate surroundings and needs. As Cedar Hollow came into view below them, Josiah felt a strange reluctance to return to the settlement. The day in the mountains with Miriam had been one of the most satisfying he could remember, challenging work, accomplished with a capable partner who shared his respect for the natural world. The thought of facing the small-minded prejudice of the townspeople felt like stepping from sunlight into shadow. Miriam seemed to share his reluctance. As they approached the edge of town, her posture became more guarded, and the easy confidence she had displayed in the mountains faded into the careful wariness that seemed to be her default expression around other people. They parted at the fork in the road that led to her cabin, but not before Miriam had carefully written out instructions for preparing the herbs they had gathered. Her handwriting was clear and precise, with detailed notes about timing and dosage that revealed her deep understanding of medicinal preparations. As Josiah rode toward the mountain trail that would take him home to Nathan, he carried with him not just the herbs that might save his brother's life, but also a new understanding of what it meant to find a true partner, someone whose strength complemented his own, whose knowledge filled the gaps in his understanding, and whose quiet courage had already begun to change the way he saw the world. The ride back to Nathan's bedside felt like the longest journey of Josiah's life, even though he pushed his horse harder than was wise on the treacherous mountain trails. The carefully wrapped herbs in his saddlebags represented hope, the first real hope he had felt since his brother had fallen ill. But hope could be a cruel companion when time was running short, and Nathan's condition had been deteriorating so rapidly that Josiah feared what he might find when he reached their cabin. Nathan was still breathing when Josiah burst through the door, but his skin had taken on the waxy pallor that spoke of a body fighting a losing battle. The carved wooden cross rose and fell weakly on his chest, and Josiah found himself offering a silent prayer to whatever powers might be listening. Their father had been a man of simple faith who believed that family bonds were sacred and that belief had sustained both brothers through years of hardship and uncertainty. Following Miriam's precise instructions, Josiah prepared the herbal medicine with the same careful attention to detail that she had shown him. The process was more complex than he had expected. Different herbs required different preparation methods, and the timing of each step was crucial to the final remedy's effectiveness. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the quiet competence with which Miriam had guided him through every aspect of their mountain expedition. The first dose went down Nathan's throat with difficulty, but he managed to swallow the bitter liquid without choking. Josiah settled beside the bed to begin the long vigil that would determine whether Miriam's knowledge and their dangerous climb had been enough to save his brother's life. Meanwhile, in Cedar Hollow, Miriam was facing a different kind of crisis. She had returned to find her Aunt Constance waiting on the front porch with an expression of deep concern. The old woman's arthritis-gnarled hands clutched a simple gold wedding ring, the ring that had belonged to Miriam's mother and the only piece of jewelry that Constance had ever considered truly precious. Constance had been turning the ring over and over in her fingers, a nervous habit that indicated serious worry. When Miriam approached, her aunt gestured for her to sit on the porch steps, then began the careful conversation that both women had been dreading for years. "The whole town is talking," Constance said, speaking slowly so that Miriam could read her lips in the fading afternoon light. "Mrs. Hendricks came by while you were gone. She wanted to know what I intended to do about your friendship with that mountain man." Miriam felt her heart sink. She had known that their expedition would generate gossip, but she had hoped that the townspeople might simply lose interest if she ignored their disapproval. The ring in her aunt's hands told a different story. This was about more than idle curiosity. She said the town council is planning to meet, Constance continued. They're calling it a discussion about public morality and protecting vulnerable citizens, but we both know what they really mean. The words hit Miriam like physical blows. The town council had the power to make life very difficult for anyone they decided was a problem, and as a deaf woman with no male relatives to protect her, Miriam was particularly vulnerable to their interference. They could make it impossible for her to purchase supplies, prevent her from using the church or the school, and generally isolate her even more completely than she already was. Constance reached out and took Miriam's hands in her own, the wedding ring pressed between their joined palms. "Your mother wore this ring for 12 years, she said softly. She faced plenty of hardship and judgment in her time, but she never let other people's opinions stop her from following her heart. She would have been proud of the woman you've become." Tears stung Miriam's eyes as she thought about her parents and the love they had shared, despite the challenges life had thrown at them. Her mother had been a strong woman who had faced down prejudice and hardship with quiet dignity, never allowing bitterness to poison her gentle spirit. The ring represented that strength, that capacity for enduring love, even in the face of adversity. "Tell me about him," Constance said. "This mountain man who has the whole town so stirred up." Miriam pulled out her slate and began writing, trying to capture in words the respect and kindness that Josiah had shown her. She wrote about his desperate love for his sick brother, his willingness to learn her way of communicating, and the way he had treated her as an equal partner rather than a burden or curiosity. Constance read the slate carefully, her expression thoughtful. "He sounds like a good man," she said finally. "But good men can bring danger as well as joy, especially for women in our situation. Are you prepared for what might come?" It was a question that Miriam had been asking herself since they had ridden out of town that morning. She knew that her growing friendship with Josiah would bring consequences, but for the first time in her life, she felt that the rewards might be worth the risks. The respect and understanding he had shown her was unlike anything she had ever experienced, and the thought of returning to her previous isolation felt unbearable. That evening, as Miriam prepared, the herbal remedies that various townspeople had begun requesting despite their public disapproval of her, she found herself thinking about the choices that lay ahead of her. She could retreat back into the safe but lonely existence she had known before Josiah's arrival, or she could continue to follow a path that might lead to happiness, but would certainly bring conflict with the community that had never truly accepted her anyway. The knock on the door came just after sunset. Miriam felt the vibration through the floorboards and opened the door to find young Tommy Patterson standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and an expression of embarrassed desperation on his face. "Miss Sinclair," he said, speaking slowly and carefully so she could read his lips. "My pa's horse came up lame this afternoon. He says maybe you could take a look at her." It was the first time in years that anyone from town had come to her for help without going through Dr. Pemberton first. Miriam nodded and gathered her supplies, following Tommy to the livery stable, where his father waited with obvious reluctance. The diagnosis was simple. The mare had stepped on a sharp stone and developed an abscess in her hoof. Miriam showed Mr. Patterson how to draw out the infection with warm poultices and gave him a supply of the herbs he would need for the treatment. As she walked home through the quiet streets of Cedar Hollow, Miriam realized that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with the town. Her expedition with Josiah had somehow given her a new authority in the eyes of people who had previously dismissed her. Whether that change would prove beneficial or dangerous remained to be seen. The wedding ring felt warm against her palm as she slipped it onto her finger for the first time since her mother's death. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she would allow herself to hope that her life was finally beginning to change for the better. 3 days after taking the mountain herbs, Nathan Brennan opened his eyes for the first time in over a week and asked for water in a voice that was weak but unmistakably lucid. Josiah nearly wept with relief as he helped his brother sit up and take small sips from a tin cup. watching color slowly return to the pale face that had looked so much like their father's in those terrifying moments when death had seemed inevitable. "The medicine worked," Nathan whispered, his fingers unconsciously touching the wooden cross at his throat. "I remember you talking about someone who knew plants. A woman from the settlement?" Josiah nodded, unable to find words adequate to express his gratitude toward Miriam Sinclair. She had not only saved Nathan's life, but had done so with a combination of knowledge, courage, and generosity that had humbled him completely. The memory of her calm competence on the dangerous cliff face, her patient instruction in plant identification, and her willingness to risk the town's disapproval to help a stranger had changed something fundamental in how he saw the world. "I owe her a debt I can never repay," Josiah said finally. "We both do." Nathan studied his brother's face with the perceptive eyes that had always been able to read Josiah's moods and motivations. "You care about her," he observed quietly. "More than just gratitude. It wasn't a question, and Josiah didn't try to deny it. In the space of a few days, Miriam had become more important to him than he was ready to admit, even to himself. The thought of returning to his previous solitary existence felt empty and meaningless, now that he had experienced what it was like to work alongside someone who understood him so completely. But caring about Miriam also meant protecting her, and Josiah was beginning to realize that his presence in her life might bring dangers that had nothing to do with mountain climbing or medicinal herbs. For 3 years, he had been looking over his shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up with him. Now, for the first time, he had someone worth staying in one place to fight for. The wanted poster was yellowed and torn at the edges, but the face drawn on it was unmistakably Josiah's, though the beard was shorter and the eyes held less of the wariness that came from years of running. The poster had been tacked to the wall of the sheriff's office in Cedar Hollow for 2 weeks, mostly ignored by a lawman who had grown lazy and complacent in a quiet mountain settlement where the most serious crimes usually involved public drunkenness or disputes over mining claims. Sheriff Bradley Morrison, no relation to the Reverend despite sharing a surname, was a man who had discovered that wearing a badge in a remote territory could be quite profitable if one knew how to exploit the opportunities that came with the position. He had been studying the poster off and on for days, not because he recognized the face, but because the reward amount was substantial enough to fund several months of comfortable living. When word reached him that a dangerous-looking stranger had been seen around town consorting with the deaf Sinclair woman, Morrison began paying closer attention to the descriptions offered by various townspeople. The physical details matched, and more importantly, the man's obvious skill with weapons and his wariness around authority figures suggested someone with experience staying ahead of the law. Morrison had already sent discreet inquiries to neighboring settlements, and the responses he received confirmed his growing suspicions. Josiah Brennan was wanted in connection with a shooting in New Mexico territory, though the details of the incident remained frustratingly vague. The reward money, however, was quite specific and very tempting. In her cabin on the edge of town, Miriam was facing harassment that had escalated beyond simple gossip and disapproving looks. Someone had scattered her carefully, tended herb, the garden during the night, trampling plants that had taken years to cultivate and destroying weeks of patient work. Worse, rocks had been thrown at her windows, and crude messages had been scrawled on her fence posts in the kind of anonymous cowardice that allowed people to express their cruelty without taking responsibility for it. Constance had aged visibly in the past week, the stress of watching her niece become the target of the town's collective displeasure, taking a toll on her already fragile health. She sat on the front porch with her knitting, but her fingers shook too badly to manage the intricate stitches that had once been her pride and joy. "Perhaps we should consider leaving," she said to Miriam as they surveyed the damage to the garden. "We could go to Denver, or maybe back east where your mother's family came from. Start fresh somewhere people don't know about. Your condition." The suggestion hit Miriam like a physical blow. This little cabin had been her home for over a decade, and the mountains around Cedar Hollow were the only landscape she had ever truly understood. The idea of abandoning everything she had built here, all the knowledge she had accumulated about local plants and healing traditions, felt like a kind of death. But more than that, leaving now would mean abandoning whatever was developing between her and Josiah. She had never experienced anything like the respect and understanding he had shown her, and the thought of walking away from that possibility seemed unbearable. She shook her head firmly and wrote on her slate, "This is our home. I won't be driven away by fear and ignorance." Constance sighed and nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "Your mother had that same stubborn streak," she said with a mixture of admiration and concern. "It served her well in some ways, but it also brought her heartache that might have been avoided." That afternoon, as Miriam worked to replant the damaged sections of her garden, she became aware of someone watching her from the tree line. When she looked up, she saw Josiah standing at the edge of the clearing with an expression of barely controlled anger on his face as he took in the evidence of vandalism and harassment. He approached slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening, but she could see the tension in his shoulders and the dangerous glint in his eyes. When he knelt beside her in the garden and began helping to clear away the trampled plants, his touch was gentle, but his jaw was set in hard lines that spoke of a man struggling to control his temper. "Who did this?" he asked, though he knew she couldn't hear him. Miriam read the question in his expression and shrugged, indicating that the perpetrators had been too cowardly to identify themselves. She could see that Josiah's anger was not directed at her, but at the people who had chosen to express their disapproval through destruction and intimidation. As they worked together to repair the damage, Miriam found herself thinking about the crossroads she had reached. She could retreat into the safe isolation she had known before, or she could continue to stand her ground and fight for the right to live her life according to her own choices. The presence of this strong, gentle man kneeling beside her in the ruins of her garden made the choice feel both more important and more dangerous than anything she had ever faced. The silver locket had belonged to Miriam's grandmother, a woman who had crossed the continent in a covered wagon and carved out a life in the Colorado wilderness through sheer determination and quiet strength. Constance pressed the small piece of jewelry into Miriam's hands one evening as they sat by the fire, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. "She never spoke much about the hardships she faced," Constance said, her voice soft with memory. "But she understood what it meant to be different, to be judged by people who never bothered to look beyond the surface. She would have recognized something of herself in you." Miriam opened the locket to reveal a tiny photograph of a woman with determined eyes and a mouth set in lines that spoke of someone who had faced adversity without flinching. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same dark hair, the same intelligent gaze, the same quiet strength that refused to be broken by circumstance or cruelty. "She wore this through 3 winters, when they had barely enough food to survive," Constance continued. "Through childbirth in a one-room soddy, through the death of 2 babies before your grandfather was born. She never complained, never gave up, never let anyone convince her that she was less than what she knew herself to be." The weight of the locket in Miriam's palm felt like an anchor, connecting her to a legacy of women who had endured and survived. As she fastened the chain around her neck, she felt a new resolve settling into her bones. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with the same quiet courage that had carried her grandmother through hardships that made Miriam's current troubles seem small by comparison. Meanwhile, Josiah was struggling with decisions that would affect not only his own future, but Miriam's safety as well. Nathan had recovered enough to sit up and take solid food, and the color had returned to his cheeks along with the easy smile that had always been his most distinctive feature. But with Nathan's recovery came the need to face questions that Josiah had been avoiding for 3 years. "Tell me about New Mexico," Nathan said one evening as they sat beside the fire in their mountain cabin. "Tell me what really happened down there." Josiah had been dreading this conversation, but he owed his brother the truth. Nathan had always been the idealistic one, the brother who believed that justice and fairness were more than just pretty words that politicians use to get elected. The story Josiah had to tell would challenge that idealism in ways that might change Nathan forever. "I was working as a deputy marshal in Santa Fe," Josiah began, his voice carefully controlled. "There was a rancher named Caldwell who had been buying up land from small farmers, sometimes using methods that weren't entirely legal. When the farmers complained to the territorial government, I was sent to investigate." Nathan listened without interruption as Josiah described finding evidence of intimidation, bribery, and violence designed to force honest families off their land. The investigation had been progressing well until Josiah discovered that Caldwell's operation extended far beyond simple land grabbing. He was involved in selling stolen cattle, running guns to hostile tribes, and using his political connections to avoid prosecution for increasingly serious crimes. "The night I was planning to make arrests, Caldwell and 3 of his men came to my hotel room," Josiah continued. "They offered me enough money to disappear and forget everything I had learned. When I refused, they made it clear that my choice was between taking their money and taking a bullet. The fight that followed had been brief and deadly. Josiah's military training and natural skill with weapons had saved his life, but when the smoke cleared, 2 men were dead, and Caldwell was wounded but alive. What should have been a clear case of self-defense became something more complicated when Caldwell's political allies arrived to control the narrative. They said I had gone rogue, that I was the one trying to shake down honest ranchers," Josiah explained. "Caldwell's friends in the territorial government backed his story, and suddenly I was the wanted man instead of the lawman trying to do his job." Nathan's face had grown increasingly grim as the story unfolded. "So you've been running ever since?" "For 3 years," Josiah confirmed, "moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, never letting anyone get close enough to get hurt when I had to leave." "Until now," Nathan observed quietly. Josiah nodded, thinking about Miriam and the way she had looked at him with trust and respect instead of fear or suspicion. "Until now. She deserves to know," Nathan said. "If you care about her the way I think you do, she deserves to know what she might be getting involved with." It was advice that Josiah knew was right, even though the thought of seeing disappointment or fear replace the warmth in Miriam's eyes made his chest tighten with dread. But Nathan was correct. Miriam had the right to make her own choices about the risks she was willing to accept, and those choices needed to be based on complete information. The next day, Josiah rode down to Cedar Hollow with a heavy heart and a mind full of doubts. He found Miriam working in her rebuilt herb garden, her movements efficient and purposeful as she tended the young plants that were already beginning to recover from the vandalism they had suffered. When she saw him approaching, her face lit up with a smile that made his resolution waver. This was the first time in years that anyone had looked at him with such uncomplicated happiness, and the thought of destroying that trust felt like a betrayal of everything good that had developed between them. But as they sat together on the front steps of her cabin, Miriam seemed to sense that something was troubling him. She brought out her slate and wrote, "What's wrong? You look like a man carrying a heavy burden." Her perceptiveness shouldn't have surprised him. She had spent her entire life reading people's expressions and body language with an accuracy that most people never developed. The question was whether she would still want to know him once she understood exactly what kind of burden he was carrying. Using a combination of gestures, written words, and careful lip-reading, Josiah began to tell Miriam the truth about his past. He watched her face carefully as he explained about the corruption in New Mexico, the fight that had left men dead, and the 3 years he had spent looking over his shoulder and sleeping with one hand on his gun. When he finished, Miriam sat quietly for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than frightened. Finally, she wrote on her slate, "Do you believe you did the right thing?" "Yes," Josiah replied without hesitation. "Then so do I," she wrote. Good men sometimes have to make hard choices. That doesn't make them bad men. The simple acceptance in her words hit Josiah like a physical blow. For 3 years, he had carried the weight of guilt and uncertainty, wondering if he could have handled things differently, if there had been another way to resolve the situation without violence. Miriam's trust felt like absolution, like the first clean breath he had taken since leaving New Mexico. Sheriff Morrison's badge caught the morning sunlight as he pinned the wanted poster to the bulletin board outside his office, but the gleam of the metal couldn't hide the dark stains that had accumulated over months of corrupt dealings. Those stains weren't just dirt. They were reminders of the compromises and betrayals that had transformed a man who had once taken an oath to protect and serve into someone who saw the law as nothing more than a tool for personal profit. The bounty hunters had arrived in Cedar Hollow just before dawn, 3 hard-faced men who rode with the casual confidence of those who made their living tracking down other human beings. Their leader, a scarred man named Vance Hutchins, had immediately sought out Morrison to discuss the profitable opportunity that Josiah Brennan represented. "We tracked him this far through contacts in Denver," Hutchins explained as they stood in the sheriff's cramped office. "Man matching his description has been asking questions about herbal medicine, sick relatives. Word is, he's been seen around your settlement with some local woman." Morrison nodded, his mind already calculating his share of the reward money. "Deaf girl named Sinclair, lives on the east edge of town with her aunt, been causing quite a stir, associating with strangers and putting on airs above her station." The contempt in Morrison's voice made it clear that he saw Miriam as nothing more than a convenient tool for capturing his real prey. Hutchins smiled, a cold expression that held no warmth or humor. "Perfect," he said. "Nothing brings a man out of hiding faster than a woman in danger. We'll take the girl, make sure Brennan knows we have her, and let his conscience do the rest of the work." What neither Morrison nor the bounty hunters realized was that their conversation was being overheard by Nathan Brennan, who had arrived in Cedar Hollow that morning to thank Miriam personally for saving his life. Still weak from his recent illness, but determined to express his gratitude properly, Nathan had been walking toward the sheriff's office to ask for directions when he heard his brother's name being discussed through the open window. The fragments of conversation he caught were enough to piece together the immediate danger. Corrupt lawmen, bounty hunters, plans to take Miriam hostage. It was exactly the kind of situation that Josiah had been trying to avoid for 3 years, and now it was threatening the woman who had become the center of his world. Nathan moved away from the window as quietly as his weakened condition allowed, his mind racing with the need to warn both Josiah and Miriam before the bounty hunters could act on their plans. But as he hurried toward the edge of town, he was intercepted by 2 of Hutchins' men who had been positioned to watch for anyone who might interfere with their operation. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Nathan, still recovering from his illness and never as skilled with weapons as his older brother, was quickly overpowered and taken prisoner, but not before he managed to shout a warning that echoed across the settlement. "Miriam, run! They're coming for you!" The warning reached Miriam as she was hanging laundry behind her cabin, but it came too late. Even as she dropped the wet clothes and turned toward the sound, Hutchins and his remaining man were already emerging from the tree line behind her. Her deafness, which had so often isolated her from the world around her, now became a deadly disadvantage as she failed to hear their approach until they were close enough to prevent any escape. The capture was accomplished with brutal efficiency. Miriam fought with surprising strength and determination, but she was no match for 2 experienced men who had no qualms about using whatever force was necessary to subdue her. Within minutes, she was bound and gagged, loaded onto a horse, and being transported to an abandoned mine shaft several miles outside town, where Hutchins planned to wait for Josiah to come looking for her. Constance, who had been resting inside the cabin, emerged to find the laundry scattered in the dirt and her niece nowhere to be seen. The old woman's heart, already weakened by years of worry and recent stress, nearly failed her as she realized what had happened. With trembling hands, she managed to harness their old mule to the cart and began the painful journey up the mountain to find Josiah. When Josiah saw Constance approaching their cabin in obvious distress, his blood turned to ice. The old woman was barely conscious from the exertion of the trip, and her first gasped words confirmed his worst fears. They took her. Men with guns. They took Miriam. The rage that filled Josiah in that moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced. For 3 years he had run from his past, always moving, never fighting back, accepting exile as the price of avoiding further violence. But now they had crossed a line that he would not allow to stand. They had threatened an innocent woman whose only crime was showing kindness to a stranger. As Constance collapsed from exhaustion and Nathan's absence became apparent, Josiah began to understand the full scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just about the bounty on his head. This was about corruption that reached from New Mexico territory all the way to this remote mountain settlement. And it was being enforced by men who saw other human beings as nothing more than commodities to be bought and sold. The revelation that followed hit him like a physical blow. Among Constance's confused explanations, one detail stood out with terrible clarity. Sheriff Morrison had been seen talking with the strangers just before Miriam disappeared. The law that Josiah had once served with honor and pride had become completely compromised, leaving him with no allies and no legal recourse. But perhaps most devastating of all was the realization that his presence in Miriam's life had brought exactly the kind of danger he had been trying to avoid. His past had caught up with him despite all his precautions, and now the woman he had come to love was paying the price for his inability to completely escape the corruption he had tried to expose years ago. Standing in his mountain cabin with Constance unconscious on the couch and Nathan's fate unknown, Josiah faced the hardest decision of his life. He could run, disappear into the wilderness, and hope that his absence would convince the bounty hunters to release Miriam unharmed. Or he could stay and fight, knowing that doing so would mean abandoning the careful control he had maintained for 3 years and embracing the violence that had marked his past. The choice, when it came down to it, was no choice at all. Miriam had saved Nathan's life and had shown Josiah what it meant to be truly understood and accepted by another person. She represented everything good and hopeful that he had discovered in this remote mountain community, and he would rather die than allow corrupt men to destroy her life, the way they had tried to destroy his. As he checked his weapons and prepared for what would likely be his final confrontation with the forces that had been hunting him, Josiah felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. For 3 years, he had been running from a fight that he now realized had been inevitable from the beginning. The corruption that had driven him from New Mexico wasn't something that could be escaped. It was something that had to be faced and defeated, regardless of the personal cost. The sun was setting over the Colorado mountains as Josiah rode down toward Cedar Hollow, no longer a fugitive trying to avoid his past, but a man determined to protect his future, even if that future could only be measured in hours rather than years. The hunting knife had been their father's, carried through years of military service and frontier living until it became as much a part of him as his own hands. Josiah hefted the familiar weight of the weapon as he prepared for what might be his final battle, feeling the connection to a man who had taught him that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. The blade was perfectly balanced, its edge honed to razor sharpness through years of careful maintenance. But more than just a tool or weapon, it represented the choice between the peaceful life Josiah had been trying to build and the violent skills that had kept him alive through 3 years of running. Tonight, those skills would serve a higher purpose than mere survival. They would be used to protect the woman who had given his life meaning and hope. As darkness settled over the mountains, Josiah began his careful approach to the abandoned mining camp where Hutchins was holding his prisoners. The bounty hunter had chosen his location well. The mine was isolated, defensible, and far enough from town that any sounds of conflict would go unheard. But Hutchins had also made a crucial mistake in underestimating the man he was trying to capture. Josiah moved through the forest with the silent efficiency of someone who had learned to survive in hostile territory, using every shadow and natural blind spot to approach the camp without detection. The skills that had made him valuable as a deputy marshal, patience, observation, tactical thinking, now served him in planning a rescue operation that would require perfect timing and flawless execution. From his concealed position on a ridge overlooking the mine, Josiah could see 3 campfires burning in the clearing below. Hutchins had posted sentries at 2 obvious approach routes, but his men were clearly more accustomed to hunting fugitives in towns and settlements than dealing with opponents who understood wilderness warfare. Their positioning revealed gaps that an experienced fighter could exploit. Through his field glasses, Josiah spotted Miriam tied to a post near the largest fire, her face pale but determined. Even in captivity, she maintained the quiet dignity that had first attracted his attention, refusing to show fear or desperation to her captors. Nathan was bound nearby, conscious but obviously still weakened from his recent illness. The sight of them both in danger because of his past filled Josiah with a cold fury that he channeled into careful planning. Hutchins had made this personal by threatening innocent people, and Josiah intended to make him pay for that mistake in ways the bounty hunter couldn't yet imagine. Meanwhile, in Cedar Hollow, an unexpected development was unfolding that would change the entire dynamic of the approaching confrontation. Dr. Pemberton had been making his evening rounds when he encountered old Pete Mackenzie, stumbling down the main street with blood streaming from a head wound and a story that shattered the town's assumptions about recent events. "Sheriff Morrison," Pete gasped, clutching the doctor's arm with trembling hands. "He's working with them bounty hunters. I seen them counting out money, planning how to split the reward for that mountain man. They took the Sinclair girl and the sick brother to force a surrender." The revelation hit the small community like a lightning bolt. Sheriff Morrison, the man they had trusted to maintain law and order, was revealed as a corrupt opportunist who had betrayed his oath and endangered innocent citizens for personal profit. The implications were staggering if the law itself was compromised. Who could the townspeople trust to protect them from the kind of violence that was clearly coming? Dr. Pemberton helped Pete to his office and began cleaning the head wound while the old man continued his story. Pete had been fishing near the old mine when he witnessed Miriam and Nathan being brought in as prisoners. He had tried to slip away unnoticed, but had been spotted by one of the sentries, who had struck him down and left him for dead. "The deaf girl saved my grandson from the fever last winter," Pete said as the doctor worked on his wounds. "If that mountain man is half the fighter folks say he is, there's going to be a war up there. And innocent people are going to die because our sheriff decided to become a bounty hunter." Word of Morrison's betrayal spread through Cedar Hollow with the speed that only scandal and crisis could achieve. Within an hour, a crowd had gathered at the church where Reverend Morrison, no relation to the corrupt sheriff despite the shared name, was leading an impromptu meeting to discuss what the community should do about the situation developing in their midst. The townspeople who had spent weeks gossiping about Miriam Sinclair's association with a dangerous stranger now found themselves facing the uncomfortable truth about their own assumptions and prejudices. The woman they had dismissed as simple-minded and potentially immoral had risked her life to help a sick man, while the lawman they had trusted had sold his integrity for bounty money. "We've been fools," declared Martha. Hendricks, the postmaster's wife, who had been among Miriam's harshest critics. "We let our fear and ignorance blind us to what was really happening. That girl has done nothing but good for this community, and we repaid her kindness with suspicion and cruelty." The sentiment was echoed by others who were beginning to recognize their own roles in creating the isolation and vulnerability that had made Miriam an easy target for men like Hutchins and Morrison. The shame of their collective behavior was made worse by the knowledge that their prejudice had contributed to putting an innocent woman in mortal danger. Young Tommy Patterson, whose father's horse Miriam had successfully treated, stood up in the back of the church. "My pa says she's got more knowledge about healing than any doctor we've ever had in this town. Maybe it's time we started judging people by what they do instead of what they can't do." The murmur of agreement that followed his words marked a fundamental shift in the community's perception of both Miriam and the events that had brought them to this crisis point. But recognition of their mistakes wasn't enough. They needed to decide what they were going to do about the immediate threat facing two innocent people who had been taken prisoner by violent men. Reverend Morrison rose from his position at the front of the church, his usually stern expression softened by genuine remorse. "We have a chance to redeem ourselves," he said simply. "Miss Sinclair and her friend need our help, and God knows we owe them that much after the way we've treated them." The decision to act came slowly, but with growing momentum, as more townspeople spoke up in support of organizing a rescue mission. These were frontier people who understood that sometimes the law wasn't enough, that communities had to take care of their own when outside forces threatened their safety and values. But good intentions weren't enough to overcome the stark reality of their situation. Most of the men in Cedar Hollow were miners, shopkeepers, and farmers, hard-working people who knew little about fighting and less about tactics. They were willing to help, but they lacked the skills and experience necessary to mount an effective assault against professional killers who had chosen their ground carefully. It was Dr. Pemberton who provided the solution they needed. "We can't fight them directly," he admitted, "but we know these mountains better than they do, and we have something they don't, the moral authority that comes from fighting for justice instead of money." His plan was simple but potentially effective. Instead of trying to match the bounty hunters' firepower, the townspeople would use their knowledge of local terrain to create diversions and confusion. While Josiah mounted his rescue attempt, they would light signal fires on distant ridges, make noise in the forest away from the mine, and generally create the impression of a much larger force moving against the camp. The goal wasn't to defeat the bounty hunters in direct combat, but to divide their attention and create opportunities for Josiah to free his prisoners and escape. It was a plan that played to the community's strengths while acknowledging their limitations, and it offered them a chance to atone for their treatment of Miriam by risking themselves to help save her. As the meeting broke up and volunteers began organizing themselves into groups with specific assignments, a sense of purpose and unity settled over Cedar Hollow that hadn't been felt since the community's founding. The crisis had forced them to confront their own prejudices and failures, but it had also given them an opportunity to prove that they were capable of choosing justice over fear, courage over convenience. High in the mountains above them, Josiah continued his patient surveillance of the enemy camp, unaware that he would soon have unexpected allies in his desperate mission to save the two people who meant more to him than his own life. The church bell began to toll just after midnight, its bronze voice carrying across the mountain valley with a sound that had called the people of Cedar Hollow to worship for 15 years. But tonight, the bell served a different purpose. It was a signal that echoed from ridge to ridge, awakening something in the community that had been dormant for too long. From his position overlooking the mining camp, Josiah heard the distant bell and felt a surge of confusion mixed with hope. The sound was coming from the direction of Cedar Hollow, but its meaning escaped him until he began to see pinpricks of light appearing on distant mountainsides, signal fires that formed a rough circle around the valley where Hutchins had made his camp. The bounty hunters heard the bell too, and their reaction was immediate alarm. Hutchins emerged from his tent with his rifle in hand, scanning the darkness for signs of approaching enemies. His men took defensive positions around the camp perimeter, their weapons trained on the tree line where shadows danced in the flickering firelight. "What the hell is that supposed to be?" "No," demanded Jake Morrison, the sheriff's younger brother who had thrown in with the bounty hunters for his share of the reward money. Trouble, Hutchins replied grimly. Somebody's organizing against us. Question is how many and how well armed. The uncertainty was exactly what Dr. Pemberton had hoped to achieve. By creating the impression of coordinated opposition without revealing the true nature or size of the force arrayed against them, the townspeople had successfully divided the bounty hunters' attention and made them question their tactical advantage. Nathan, bound and gagged near one of the fires, recognized the sound of the church bell and understood its significance. The people of Cedar Hollow, the same people who had treated his brother as a dangerous outsider and Miriam as a burden, were risking their own safety to help with this rescue. The realization filled him with a mixture of gratitude and amazement at how completely the situation had transformed. Miriam felt the vibrations of the bell through the ground beneath her, and though she couldn't hear its sound, she could see the tension and confusion it was causing among her captors. Her intelligent eyes missed nothing as she observed the bounty hunters' reactions, noting which men seemed most nervous and where their attention was focused. Despite her bonds and the gag that prevented her from speaking, Miriam began to plan her own contribution to whatever rescue attempt was developing. She had spent her entire life compensating for her deafness by becoming extremely observant, and that skill was serving her well now as she identified weaknesses in her captor's vigilance. Josiah used the distraction created by the bell and signal fires to begin his approach to the camp. Moving with the silent precision of a hunter stalking dangerous prey, he worked his way down the rocky slope toward the tree line that surrounded the clearing. Every shadow became his ally. Every sound from the nervous bounty hunters masked his own movement. The first sentry never knew what hit him. Josiah's approach was so quiet and swift that the man had no chance to cry out before being rendered unconscious by a precise blow to the base of his skull. The hunting knife that had belonged to his father remained in its sheath. Josiah wanted to avoid killing unless absolutely necessary, but he was prepared to use whatever force was required to save his friends. As he dragged the unconscious sentry into the underbrush, Josiah heard voices from the main camp growing more agitated. The signal fires were having their intended effect, creating uncertainty and paranoia among men who were accustomed to having every advantage in their confrontations with wanted fugitives. "I count at least 6 fires," one of the bounty hunters was saying. "Could be 40, 50 men. Out there for all we know." "Calm down," Hutchins snapped, but even his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "It's probably just locals trying to spook us. Bunch of shopkeepers and farmers don't amount to much of a threat." But his words carried less conviction than usual, and Josiah could see that the carefully planned psychological warfare was achieving its purpose. The bounty hunters were beginning to question whether their isolated position was as advantageous as they had initially believed. The second sentry was posted near a pile of mining equipment that provided excellent cover for Josiah's approach. This man was more alert than his companion, turning frequently to scan the forest behind him. But his attention was focused on the distant signal fires rather than the immediate threat moving through the shadows, just yards away. When Josiah struck, it was with the same silent efficiency that had neutralized the first guard. But this time, the unconscious man's rifle clattered against a piece of mining machinery, producing a metallic sound that carried clearly through the night air. "Hey!" shouted one of the men near the main fire. "Thompson, you all right over there?" The moment of discovery had arrived sooner than Josiah had hoped, but he was ready for it. As shouts of alarm began to fill the clearing, and the remaining bounty hunters scrambled to respond to the threat they couldn't yet see, Josiah prepared for the direct confrontation that would determine whether his desperate rescue mission would succeed or end in tragedy for everyone he had come to care about. The first gunshot shattered the mountain silence as Hutchins fired blindly into the tree line where he thought he had seen movement. The muzzle flash lit up his scarred face for an instant, revealing the cold fury of a man who had built his reputation on intimidation and was now finding himself outmaneuvered by what he had assumed would be easy prey. Josiah used the confusion following the shot. to sprint across the open ground toward the post where Miriam was bound. She saw him coming, and her eyes widened with a mixture of relief and terror, relief at seeing him alive and coming to help, terror at the danger he was placing himself in by exposing himself to hostile fire. "Miriam!" Josiah shouted, forgetting for a moment that she couldn't hear him. But she read his lips easily in the firelight and nodded to show she understood. When he reached her, she managed to work the gag loose from her mouth, despite her bound hands. What happened next would echo through both their memories for the rest of their lives. "Josiah," she said, her voice clear and strong despite years of silence. "Behind you." The sound of her voice hit him like a physical blow, not just because she had spoken, but because she had found her voice at the exact moment when her warning saved his life. He spun around to see Jake Morrison raising his rifle, and Josiah's father's hunting knife left his hand in a smooth arc that ended with Morrison crying out in pain and dropping his weapon. The camp erupted into chaos as the remaining bounty hunters realized they were under attack by someone who clearly knew what he was doing. But their disorganization worked against them in their panic to respond to threats from multiple directions. They began firing at shadows and each other, creating more confusion than effective defense. Miriam's voice had carried clearly across the clearing, shocking everyone who heard it. The townspeople hiding in the forest had witnessed something they would talk about for the rest of their lives, the moment when love and desperation had given voice to someone who had been silent for over 2 decades. Hutchins had finally located his primary target and was taking careful aim when Nathan, despite his weakness and bonds, managed to roll into the bounty hunter's legs. The shot went wild, and Hutchins stumbled backward into the fire, his clothing catching flame and his curses filling the air as he tried to beat out the burning fabric. "The horses!" Miriam called to Josiah, her newfound voice strong with urgency. "Cut Nathan loose and get to the horses." Her tactical thinking was as sharp as her voice was clear. The horses represented their only chance of escaping the valley before more bounty hunters could arrive, or the surviving members of Hutchins's gang could regroup for a coordinated counterattack. Josiah slashed through Nathan's bonds with his recovered hunting knife, then helped his still weakened brother to his feet. Nathan was pale and shaking from exhaustion, but his eyes were bright with amazement at what he had just witnessed. "Did she just—" Nathan began. Later, Josiah interrupted, supporting his brother with one arm while keeping his rifle ready with the other. "Right now, we need to get out of here." The 3 of them made their way toward the rope corral, where the horses were tethered. But Hutchins had recovered from his encounter with the fire and was positioning himself to cut off their escape route. His clothes were still smoldering, and his face was twisted with rage at being humiliated by what he had assumed would be a simple capture operation. "Nobody leaves here alive," he screamed, raising his rifle for a killing shot. But the voice that answered him came from the darkness beyond the firelight, strong and authoritative, with the moral conviction of aroused justice. It was Reverend Morrison, leading a group of armed townspeople who had finally overcome their fear and indecision. "Put down your weapons," the Reverend commanded. "You're outnumbered and surrounded. Sheriff Morrison is already in custody, and your operation is finished." The standoff that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours to everyone involved. Hutchins looked around the clearing, taking in the bodies of his unconscious men, the approaching townspeople, and the 3 people he had been hired to capture standing, united against him. The calculation in his eyes was cold and practical. He was a businessman who dealt in violence, not a fanatic, willing to die for a lost cause. When he slowly lowered his rifle and raised his hands in surrender, it marked the end of more than just a failed bounty hunt. For Miriam, it was the moment when her voice returned and her isolation ended forever. For Josiah, it was vindication that sometimes standing and fighting was better than running. For the people of Cedar Hollow, it was proof that a community united by justice could overcome threats that would have defeated them individually. The corruption that had driven Josiah from New Mexico and followed him to Colorado had finally met its match in the form of people willing to risk themselves for what was right. As dawn broke over the mountains, it illuminated not just the end of a crisis, but the beginning of a new chapter for everyone involved. 6 months after the confrontation at the old mine, Cedar Hollow had transformed into something entirely different from the suspicious, insular community it had once been. The wedding rings that adorned Miriam and Josiah's hands were simple bands of gold, fashioned by the local blacksmith, who had volunteered his services as part of the town's collective effort to make amends for their past treatment of the woman who had become their most valued citizen. The wedding ceremony itself had taken place in the little church, where the townspeople had once gathered to gossip about Miriam's association with a dangerous stranger. Now that same building was filled with genuine celebration as the entire community came together to witness the union of two people whose love had literally found its voice in the darkest moment of crisis. Reverend Morrison, who had once questioned the propriety of their friendship, now spoke eloquently about the power of love to overcome barriers and the importance of judging people by their actions rather than their circumstances. His sermon that day was one that would be remembered and quoted throughout the territory, a meditation on redemption that applied as much to the community as to the couple standing before him. Miriam's voice, which had emerged in that desperate moment when Josiah's life hung in the balance, had proven to be strong and clear once the barriers of fear and isolation were removed. Dr. Pemberton theorized that her deafness had never affected her ability to speak, rather, it was the years of discouragement and dismissal from others that had convinced her there was no point in trying to communicate in a world that didn't want to listen. Now she spoke regularly, though she still preferred the visual languages of gesture and written word for complex conversations. Her voice was most often heard in moments of joy or urgency, as if it had been reserved for the times when ordinary communication wasn't sufficient to carry the weight of what needed to be said. Nathan had made a complete recovery from his illness and had chosen to remain in Cedar Hollow rather than returning to the isolated mountain cabin where he and Josiah had lived for so many years. The community had welcomed him warmly, grateful for his role in helping to expose Sheriff Morrison's corruption and his courage during the final confrontation with the bounty hunters. The carved wooden cross still hung around Nathan's neck, but now it represented not just faith and family bonds, but also the power of community to support and protect its members. He had found work as a teacher in the settlement's small school, where his patient nature and genuine care for children made him popular with both students and parents. Sheriff Morrison and the surviving bounty hunters had been transported to Denver for trial, where the evidence of corruption and kidnapping had resulted in lengthy prison sentences. The revelations about Morrison's dealings had prompted a territorial investigation that uncovered similar corruption in several other frontier settlements, leading to reforms that would protect future communities from the kind of predatory law enforcement they had endured. Hutchins himself had not survived the journey to Denver. The burns he had suffered during the fight at the mine had become infected, and despite Dr. Pemberton's best efforts to treat him, the bounty hunter had died in the settlement's small jail cell while awaiting transport. His death had been neither celebrated nor mourned. It was simply the inevitable conclusion to a life spent profiting from the suffering of others. Miriam's herb practice had evolved from a secretive pursuit conducted on the margins of society into a respected medical service that drew patients from settlements throughout the territory. Her knowledge of botanical medicine, once dismissed as superstition, was now sought after by doctors and healers who recognized the depth of her understanding and the effectiveness of her treatments. The herb garden behind their cabin had expanded into a small farm where Miriam cultivated not only medicinal plants, but also the rare varieties that grew wild in the high mountains. Josiah had proven to be an eager student of her botanical knowledge, and together they had begun documenting the healing properties of mountain plants in a comprehensive guide that would eventually be published and distributed throughout the frontier territories. Their home had become a gathering place for the community, where people came not only for medical treatment, but also for the warmth and acceptance that radiated from a couple who had learned to see past surface differences to the essential humanity that connected all people. The isolation that had once defined both their lives had been replaced by a network of relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Miriam and Josiah often sat on their front porch in the evening, watching the sun set over peaks that had witnessed so much change in such a short time. Their conversations were a mixture of spoken words, gestures, and comfortable silences that spoke to the deep understanding they had developed. Constance, now in her 80s but still sharp and determined, had lived to see her niece find the happiness and acceptance that had seemed impossible just a year before. The old woman spent her days teaching the settlement's children the traditional crafts she had learned in her youth, passing on skills and knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The wedding rings they wore were more than symbols of their love for each other. They represented the triumph of acceptance over prejudice, of courage over fear, and of community over isolation. Cedar Hollow had learned that strength came not from excluding those who were different, but from embracing the unique gifts that each person brought to the collective whole. As winter approached and the mountain passes began to close with snow, Miriam and Josiah faced the future with the quiet confidence of people who had found their place in the world. They had learned that love could indeed overcome any barrier, that truth was stronger than corruption, and that sometimes the greatest courage was found not in fighting, but in choosing to trust and be vulnerable with another human being. The story that had begun with laughter and cruelty had ended with wedding bells and community celebration, proving that even in the harsh wilderness of the frontier territories, hope and love could take root and flourish in the most unlikely soil.